QSO Today, episode 210, Tony Hutchison, VK5ZAI. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Karen Guth, Eric's XYL. Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, hosts the rest of this episode, but does not have voice this week from a bad cold to make the introduction to his guest today. One of the ways to get your pin on the map, especially if you live in rural Australia, is to provide amateur radio ground support to manned NASA space flight missions. Eric's guest today is Tony Hutchison, VK5ZAI, who, from his interest in satellite communications, became an important backup communications link in South Australia for the NASA Space Shuttle missions, the Mir Space Station, and the International Space Station when crewed by amateur radio operators. Tony is a pioneer in this area of ham radio and has been recognized by NASA for his contributions. VK5ZAI is Eric's QSO Today.
VK5ZAI, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Tony?
Yes, I am, Eric, and good day to you.
Good day, Tony. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I started probably when I was about 7 years old. I was born in 1939 and started basically just after the war, I suppose, when disposals equipment, military equipment became available. My first bit of electronic gear was a military disposals telephone. And I set this up between myself and my neighbours, and I guess you'd say it grew from there. From there I went on up, I think it's a 2-valve audio amplifier. Had to be battery stuff, using a 3V4 and a 1T4 from memory, because we used to have a 32-volt lighting plant. Being living in the country, we weren't connected to the AC mains, and everything was battery. And then I think I went from there up to a 5-valve radio, and then I went off to boarding school for several years, and I learned a lot there, but didn't do much experimenting. But then when I came home, I got more interested in construction again, which I still love constructing stuff. And because we're on 32 volts, Mum bought me a 32-volt inverter to wind the 32 volts up to 240 volts, and that, and alongside with Jenny motors that were released on disposals, I sort of started to get interested in amateur radio, and I had probably 40 kilometres away was the first ham radio person that I ever met. That was Bob, VK3ARM, and then Herb, who was about 60 kilometres away, 70 kilometres, was VK3NN, and Gordon, VK5CC. Unfortunately, these three our silent keys have been for quite a few years, and Bob, I suppose, was the main one because he was the closest, and I used to go over there at weekends, probably every 2 or 3 weeks, the weekend, and watch him. There's all home constructed equipment, and have a chat on the ham bands, mainly mainly 80 metres he was using then, and also 2 metres. And that was the start, I guess.
Everyone can hear from your accent that you're obviously not from the United States, and with the VK call that puts you someplace in Australia. Can you tell us where you are and where the story began? What part of Australia?
Yes, I live in South Australia, and where I was living then was on a sheep grazing property in Border Town, which is not far from the Victorian border, basically between the capital city of South Australia, which is Adelaide, and capital city of Victoria, which is Melbourne. And that's where we started.
So when you say you're driving 40 kilometers to the nearest ham radio club, you were driving into Adelaide?
No. We were roughly 4 hours drive from Adelaide. I was just driving over the border into Victoria, where Victoria VK3s and Bob VK3ARM was just over the border in a little town called Surveston. Once again, he was a farmer, and in fact, the whole three, Herb and Gordon, we were all farmers, and they just coached me along, and of course with the aid of the ARRL handbook and the RSGB book and a lot of reading, I got my license, and I think in 1960 anyway. I was about 21 years old.
What did that license entitle you to do when you first got it?
It was I was one of the first to get what they call a Z license, being VK5ZAI, and it had just been released where you were restricted and weren't allowed on the HF bands, but you were allowed on the VHF bands, and that is where I got started. Back then, there was virtually no commercial gear on the 2 meters. Was the first band I ventured onto, and there was no commercial gear available in Australia at that time. So, first of all, I can remember before I had my license, I actually built up a shortwave receiver, all valve, of course, in those days. And that covered from the bottom end of the broadcast band up to 30 megs, and then I ran a 2 meter converter into that. And of course, back in those days, it was all analog tuning, and you'd very, very carefully turn the tuning knob to get the frequency correct. Which again was just an analog scale, much different from the ease of nowadays, where you dial up the frequency and once you're on the frequency, you don't shift it. That's the way it is today. But it was fun. My first transmitter I built, or I started building it just before I sat for my license, and that was actually built up out of an old SCR 522 aircraft transceiver, which became available on once again through ex-military disposals. And back then, of course, there was quite a lot of stuff released from about the mid-40s up until probably about 1970, I suppose, and then it started to dwindle out. And about that time, commercial stuff started to come as Yaesu and ICOM and Kenwood and a few other lesser-known makes. And
did you see in those days in Australia the American manufacturers like Swan and Hallicrafters and those radio manufacturers?
Yes, there was a percentage of that stuff, but price-wise, it was very expensive equipment, and back in those days, it was well, to be honest, it was a bit out of my reach. And secondly, I've always been a great person on construction. I love construction of electronics, and I think the true form of amateur radio initially was constructing and building something yourself, and getting that real thrill when that voice came through the speaker. But I don't know whether there was much VHF and UHF stuff that was coming in till much later.
With your Z license in a relatively rural part of Australia, was there a lot of activity in the VHF band when you were on the air?
Yes, there was. There was a lot of activity when the Communication Authority in Australia agreed to releasing a restricted license. Which you got the restricted license, you had to sit for the full examination, but you didn't need to sit for the Morse code, which was, I think, 14 words a minute back then. And I was never really interested in Morse, and I'm still not really interested in it. I can copy it very slowly, but that's about it. But when they released this license, it released a lot of younger ones that were in the same position as myself, not interested in Morse, more interested in experimenting, and there became quite a boost in VHF, UHF activity in the 1960s. I still hold the same license today here. Oh golly, what would it be? 20 odd years ago now, I think. They changed the act again and have given us the Z calls now. We hold an advanced license, and we're not restricted at all.
Okay, so there was a lot of young people on VHF, horizontally polarized, I guess, and either AM or single sideband?
Yes, it started off about the time that a lot of the taxi services and government services in Australia were throwing out a lot of their old valve. VHF was used quite extensively in the taxi service, mainly equipment made by Pi back then, and it was they were throwing out their valve equipment and going for solid state equipment, and a terrific lot of hams could get hold of this stuff pretty cheaply and modify it for 2 meters, and that got a lot of them on the air.
Were you involved in building repeaters and other kind of devices in order to extend the range of those VHF radios?
Yes, we back then we had a repeater sitting on top of the Adelaide Hills, and we had two repeaters up there, and this enabled me to get the 200 odd miles that Adelaide was away, get into Adelaide. But Adelaide's got a mountain range about 2,500 feet, which is not very high, but it's virtually built on the west side of that, between that and the sea, and it used to be almost impossible to get into Adelaide, but with the repeater it opened up a new venture. Of course, all our repeater systems are vertically polarized, and for DX on VHF, UHF, we still use horizontal polarization.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yes, it did. I came back onto the farm after I had a private education in Adelaide, in which I went to boarding school, and I managed to get home 3 times per year during that period. Hence the lack of construction of anything during then. But I got married in 1963, and I had my license by then, as I say, I got that in 1960, and fortunately my wife enjoyed having a hobby. She played netball in those days, and also very fond of reading. She used to like reading a great deal, and we spent a lot of our courting days in the radio shack. She'd have a book in her hand, I'd have a microphone in mine. But anyway, I came back on the family farm, and I don't know whether I was ever cut out to be a farmer, although I did enjoy the life, and I wouldn't swap it now. But after I got married, there was a bit of a deal in a bit of a slump in prices of wheat and wool in Australia, and I had the offer to get into an electronics career in the little town of Bordertown at that stage. So I went into that, and mainly doing servicing of TV and two-way radios. We did have others in the town, but the other guys were all at about 3 other technicians. They were all quite a bit older than me, and about that stage, transistors started to come into play, and bit by bit, each one of the local technicians would ring up and say, "Oh, we don't understand these 3-wire fuses, and you may like to do those repairs for us." So, bit by bit, I took over at one stage I was the only technician in town that can handle solid-state stuff.
You spent most of your career in the communications repair business, or did your career evolve into something else?
Yes, I spent quite a few years. I was working for a contract basis with one of the local retailers in town, and he, as he got older, he decided it's time to sell the business, and I was offered first choice, but I could never see myself retailing business, sitting in a shop all day selling stuff. Anyway, I introduced one of my friends to the business, and he bought it, and I kept on the servicing side. But at that stage, the guy we bought it from, he had some 200 odd TV sets out on rental to motels and hotels, etc. And that was quite a lucrative business. So my colleague who bought the retail side, we went halves in that side of things. We carried on for many years like that until 1988. But back in the 70s, Bordertown never had a very good radio station, and reception was very bad for the ordinary broadcast AM radio. So Gordon, VK5ZAI, and called on me one night and suggested that we needed a what they call a community FM station there to give people local news and local programs, etc. And he said, would I be interested in doing handling the technical side? Gordon at that stage he was quite an active amateur in his early days, but he was getting a bit older, and I said yes. We did a bit of research, and so we started an FM station after about 2 years of testing equipment and collecting information on who was interested in, who wasn't, and and then of course we had to get approval of the Communications Authority and the government, and anyway we established that in around about 1974, I suppose, and I was presented with a lifetime membership for the work I'd done here a few years ago, and the station is still going well. providing music, entertainment, and information to all the people of Bordertown.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. It is time to get the ICOM transceiver that is best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative transceivers that fit your ham radio budget. See how you can make the most out of contest season with one of these fine transceivers. The IC7851 has the competitive edge that you've been looking for and the endorsement by Dr. Ulrich Rohde, N1UL, on episode 208 of the QSO Today podcast as being the best transceiver on the market today. Raise the bar and hear what others cannot with this flagship HF and 50 MHz transceiver. This is due to ICOM engineers focusing on the new local oscillator design that drastically reduces phase noise. This noise reduction and purity of the LO results in an RMDR of 110 dB, allowing you to hear the extremely weak signals, making the IC7851 the perfect rig for making contacts at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. In addition, this fine rig has a spectrum scope, dual receivers, and a digital voice recorder. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM 7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way that an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. This rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with compact design that will far exceed your expectations. It includes an RF direct sampling system, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD card memory slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com, and when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, it says in your resume online that you became interested in satellite communications in as early as 1963, about the same time that you got married. How did you become interested in satellite communications? How did that begin for you?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I was young, enthusiastic, and plenty of energy then, and I thought to myself, this is going to be the next great thing in the world. And I built up equipment, and at that stage I had a helical antenna, or a dual helical antenna actually, with a big reflector behind it, very similar to what I've got now, except it was very, very basic the way it was built, and it was manually controlled quite often by my wife. Actually, she would.
You had the old field phones that you kept from when you were a kid, and you had her on one end, and you were in the other end, and you tell her to pan right, pan left, tilt up, tilt down.
Yep. No. We'd gone a little bit further than that, and we had an intercom between us. Actually, my shack was set up at that stage. I don't think we might have had our first daughter, but I don't think we did. We had a spare bedroom ready for more family when they arrived, and at that stage I had the shack in the end bedroom of the house, and out the window I built the antenna, and so we had an eyeball with each other, but we had headphones between us, and back then, of course, we didn't have computers. We had to work out the mathematically where the space station, the satellite was going to be. It was Oscar 3 was the satellite, and basically it would send the message hi to you, and very simple telemetry, which would give us the voltage of the battery and temperature, I think, and we worked from that. But it also had a repeater in it. I did manage to get through once to a colleague about 300 kilometres away and just say hello to him. And that was my first introduction to satellites. And after that, it got me more and more interested. And but we went into a couple of other things. It's roughly about I just played with the communication satellites there, but then coming up, as I say, in the 70s, I got involved in community radio, which took up quite a bit of time, and we had always had a love for or a desire to build a boat to put on the river. As the kids got older, I remember my son was 14 at the time, and he's the youngest one of the family. We decided we're going to build a houseboat for the river. It was a 62-foot long boat, and we went ahead and built that and launched it November 1984 on the river. And we used to spend quite a bit of time holidaying on that. I had radio on it, of course, and that was located about 100 kilometres from where we lived, and of course I had to transport it up to Murray Bridge at the time, which is towards Adelaide, and put it on the Murray River. And that and then of course kids growing up, you're expected to join in some of their activities. Two girls, they were keen on horses, so you had to take them to Pony Club. My son, he was keen on Scouts. So I had to take him to Scouts, and then they got interested in other things. So I guess I did the family bit between the 70s and 80s to try and keep them entertained as well.
You never lost your love and interest in satellites. What's the rig for satellites? I mean, and we'll get more into what you're doing now with or what you've been doing up to now with satellites and what you're doing now. But what is the rig to operate satellites?
If I can just diverge a little bit from that for a minute. In 1988, we moved from border town up to the Riverland, which is Loxton, up on the Murray River, and naturally I sold my business in border town, and of course having electronics as a business as well as a hobby. The hobby sort of interest waned a little bit there for a few years, as I say, along with the family commitments, etc. But when I got up in the Riverland in 1988, I renewed my interest in electronics because I was more or less semi-retired then. I know my wife often, we have to pay for our radio license here each year, whereas in the US they don't. But my wife often said, why do you still keep your license? You're not using amateur radio. I said, I will one day. And anyway, in the Riverland, I got into it. First of all, with the Mia station, amateur radio station. My first rig was a FT11, I think it was.
Okay, well, let's stop there for just a second, because you just said something I don't want to gloss over it. You just talked about a Mir radio station. What do you mean by a Mir radio station?
Okay, sorry. Mir was the Russian base station, and I first got interested in the digital satellites. That was Oscar KO-23, 25, and UO-22, and of course Oscar 10 and Oscar 13, the communication satellites that were a real challenge because they were out 60,000 kilometres or so, or went out to that. But then I got interested in this Russian Mir space station, and so I used to tune around, and then finally I heard them speaking. We had an amateur girl in Melbourne who could speak Russian quite clearly, and she used to she used to speak to them in Russian.
The Mir space station had an amateur radio station on board?
Yes, it was the first amateur radio station on a space station, and they used to speak to other amateurs all around the world. But Maggie, VK5ZAI, used to speak regularly in Russian to them. But anyway, I'd call, and finally I got someone to answer me one day, and was Alex Serebrov. Unfortunately, Alex is a silent key now as well. I used to call MIR, which is Russian Mir Space Station, and Alex came back. And we struck up a very close friendship, and he would, and of course, they plus 3 hours UTC time, and we are plus 9.5. I think I plus, yep. Anyway, Alex used to call me about 10 or 11 o'clock most nights, and well, I say most nights, probably twice a week. And wife would give me a poke in the ribs and said, "Alex is calling you." I was lucky. I've always had a shack in the house, radio shack, and that was only a stone's throw from our bedroom. And she would hear him call. I'd go out and I'd have a chat to Alex, and I made my first amateur radio contact with him. Then I asked him one day, I said, "Would you be interested in speaking to the science students of Loxton High School?" And Alex's reply, well, he said, "I would be very interested," and he said, I'll dedicate the link up to Krista McAuliffe, who was the teacher that was incinerated in the Challenger disaster, I think in 1986. Anyway, we picked a time and a date. The students came out to I lived about 14 kilometres out of Loxton on the Murray River, and the students came out, and Alex came up, and I think I got about 10 or 12 questions, of which was the first contact that I ever did, and that on August the 27th coming up, that'll be exactly 25 years since I did my first school educational link-up for myself anyway. That's where human spaceflight, or manned spaceflight, first got me interested, and it went on from there.
So 25 years ago, your first contacts were with the Mir space station and Alex on board the Mir. And obviously the Mir space station has since entered Earth's atmosphere and burnt up, right? So now we have the International Space Station and other satellites. Are you involved with other satellites? Do you like to operate satellite mode in addition to talking to the International Space Station?
Yes, we once again shifted again. There's a bit of a story. I ended up with heart problems in when I was 56 anyway, and the heat up in the Riverland got too much for me. The days up there, the 45, 48 degrees in the summer, and
we're talking 45 degrees centigrade.
Yes,
which is what, 120 degrees Fahrenheit? It's quite warm.
Yeah, something like that, which is pretty hot. We loved it up there. It was going to be our retirement, but unfortunately the heat started to knock me around a bit after I'd had heart surgery. So we decided to come back, and we're living now in Kingston, what they call Kingston Southeast, or Kingston by the Sea. It's a small town of about 2,000 people on the southeast coast of South Australia, between Adelaide and Mount Gambier. We're only about an hour and a half from Mount Gambier, which is our regional city. I got interested in Oscar 40, which was once again a very exciting satellite, because it had an orbit that went out a long way, and you could contact Europe and the US through it. But unfortunately, it had a rather short life, developed problems. I think a 2-meter side was first to drop out, and eventually it disappeared. But I was still working the Media Space Station when the Russians, Russia and America got together, and Russia installed a docking ring for the space shuttle on it, and several U.S. astronauts that flew on the Mir space station in the latter years before it was ditched into the Pacific in 2001. One person was Andy Thomas, who was born in Adelaide, and he went to America, became an American citizen, and Andy flew on the space station, the Russian space station, for 4 months, I think it was, and I did all of Andy's communications for him between his parents and anyone he wished to speak to. I suppose you say, had a bit of a link in the fact that his father, myself, and Andy, we all attended the same boarding school. Not together, obviously, but I guess we had a common old school tie to that bonded us together. But I knew Andy's father extremely well, and fortunately he has passed away as well now. I did pretty well all of Andy's communications for him in that period. Then at that stage they were in the throes of putting the International Space Station together, and I was asked if I wanted to join this new group called ARIS, which is short for Amateur Radio on the International Space Station. And I said, yes, yeah, I'd be very keen to. And I was selected as one of the 10 telebridge stations that could handle communications for the International Space Station. And at that stage, I was the only one in Australia doing it. And I did quite a bit of work for the first commander, Bill Shepherd, on the International Space Station. Their communications weren't particularly good back then, and they could only speak to their family or communications while they're over the US. But I did a lot of links for the first 3 crews on the space station, that they could speak to their family and friends, and that went on for, I think, 3 or 4 crews. There was.
And now this message from QRP Labs. Hans Summers, G0UPL, informs me that he has sold over 5,000 QCX transceiver kits. I hope that in large part this is due to the promotion on the QSO Today podcast of this amazing single-board transceiver kit for under $50 from QRP Labs. The QCX is a feature-packed high-performance single-band 5-watt CW transceiver kit with whisper beacon and built-in alignment and test equipment tools. It is available for 80, 60, 40, 30, 20, or the 17-meter bands. It has a rotary encoder synthesized tuning, VFO A-B split, iambic keyer, CW decoder, and more. You can assemble this kit yourself with standard tools and a soldering iron. There are no surface mount components to solder, as the 2 SMD ICs are already factory pre-soldered on the board. Of course, Hans has a whole range of accessories to trick out this ride, using the language of hot rod cars. Since Hans has shipped over 5,000 QCXs, there is a rapidly growing community of builders and users who are fine-tuning the QCX in an open-source kind of way and sharing it with us on the Internet. So if you're ready to build your own rig, or want to save money, or just want that prepper rig for your bomb shelter, use the link on this week's show notes page to get to QRP Labs. Please use my link, as it tells Hans that you heard about it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now, back to our QSO Today. Tony, when you said that you're one of 10 on the Telebridge team, or one of the Telebridge stations, does Telebridge mean that you had a phone patch between your rig and the public switch telephone network in order to make phone calls?
That's correct. There were 10 of us selected around the world. We had another one in South Africa. We had another one in Honolulu. We had the Johnson Space Center, the Goddard Space Center, another one in Santa Rosa in California, and Roscosmos in Russia, and that was about it. And yes, I was approved to run a phone patch or phone interface between the radio, and I would patch whoever was on the other end through mainly family and friends in America. But I did for Susan Helms. She had a sister living in Germany, and I know I patched through to Germany several times so she could speak to her sister when she was living over there. So that's all started. But in 2001, my wife Jill and I received an invitation from NASA saying that we request your company in the US for I think I said for a month or a few weeks. We would like you to meet the astronaut crews that you've worked with and see the launch of STS-102, and that was in March 2001. So, needless to say, they don't, and we were accepted. They said you've been accepted as family and friends of the astronaut corps, which meant we mixed with them and had meals with them and treated as the same as they were, which was a big honour.
I think that's a wonderful event. What interests me is, and probably some of the listeners is that you're running these phone patches from the International Space Station into the public switch telephone network. How long was the window when you first acquired the space shuttle until it disappeared over the horizon? How long could you create a conversation and a phone patch?
We had an absolute maximum of 10 minutes, providing it's a reasonably high pass, maximum elevation of, say, 60 degrees, anything over that. You've got about 10 minutes, and it drops off to perhaps 5 minutes at times if you get a very low one. I'm in a fortunate position here. I did pick where we built our house down here at Kingston for retirement. We're only 350 metres from the sea, and we have a national park on the other side, which with very low coastal vegetation, no more than probably about 20, 25 feet high, and very few houses around. So we have an ideal position for our antenna from looking at horizon to horizon. Would
you create a schedule for Susan or Andy? I guess Andy was on the Mir, but for Susan or the other astronauts, would you create a schedule so that you'd catch them up on the next pass? Or did you try to do everything in that 10-minute pass, if it was even 10 minutes, to make the call and create some kind of a conversation? No, the whole lot's arranged through NASA, all the crew contacts. They would suggest a time to the mission control, and mission control would work out when the space station was going to be over me or within range of me, and they would notify the astronaut on board and myself for such and such a time. And of course, the most of these contacts were in the late evening or middle of the night, because the ISS keeps to UTC time, and which I quite enjoyed doing it. We have done some emergency communications. I did emergency communications for Mir one time when I had a fire on board. I did emergency communications twice for the ISS when they've had problems, lost their normal communications, and we supplied that. But it's been an extremely interesting life. But since then, the schools I did on Mir were something that was arranged between
the crew on Mir and myself. We also, on Mir, we had a very active packet system, and when Andy was up there, we'd communicate a lot via packet radio as well, which was convenient, which meant I didn't have to get up in the middle of the night I just leave a message, should automatically be loaded up there, and Andy would read it when he woke up in the morning.
And that's because they had a store and forward packet system on the International Space Station?
On
Mir.
The Mir, the Russian
on the Mir, yes, okay.
space station. We have got one on the International Space Station. It did fail here last year, but they are getting it up and running again. Hopefully, the new equipment will be flown up in November, I think, on a cargo rocket, and we will maybe October this year, and they hope to have it operational in November at this stage. But the crew don't use it a great deal. I think I've had 2 or 3 since the space station's been up there in 2000. I've had about 2 or 3 packet communications, I think, since then, but there wouldn't be any more. Originally, the crew, when they only started off with 2 on the space station, and we used to get a lot of the hams up there, the astronaut hams, we'd call CQ as they passed over various countries, and we'd have a good conversation. But as they got more up there, now they have 6 permanently up there that swap out 3 every 3 months. And in other words, so the crew go up for 6 months at a time, and they swap 3 out, and one in 3 months, and the other 3. And they get enough conversation, I think, between themselves rather than call many CQs. Unfortunately, the last one they used to call CQ a lot was Bill MacArthur. Bill was he was extremely keen on ham radio, and I think he's probably the only ham in the world that has worked every country in the world on 2 meters, or practically every major country anyway on 2 meters, and worked every state in the US on 70 centimeters.
Well, that's pretty amazing.
That's going to take a bit of beating, I think.
You know, I saw an interview with you on Australian television that's available on YouTube, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes page, that described your ham shack as built entirely from scratch from cast-off gizmos. Can you explain what kind of gizmos are in your shack right now that you've been using to play this role with NASA? I think that was a little bit of an exaggeration. I did have a big old disposals 2-meter linear amplifier that I had, and I used to belong to the Civil Aviation Department, and I think the person that interviewed me, she referred to that as a cast-off gizmo, and I was describing the antenna that I used to use to her, and for counterbalance of the elevation, the antenna I've got now is a 10 on 2 meters 10-turn helix, which is about 16, 18 feet long, and this of course is the elevation rotator to work, make it easier for that to work. I've counterbalanced it, but the initial antenna I had, I'd counterbalanced it with some concrete bricks that I securely wired onto the end of it, but that was going back a few years. It now has poured concrete counterweights on the end of it. I think that's what she may have been referring to as these gizmos. So what's the shack, though? What's in your shack? What kind of transceivers are you using to do this work?
I have a combination. I started off using a little 411 handheld for the Mir space station, with a little handheld with about 100-watt amplifier in front of it. Then I moved from there up to a Yaesu FD736, and because initially we most of the approved telebridge stations, they wanted you to have a backup of everything. So I had a backup phone interface unit. Then my antennas now, incidentally, are all computer controlled. I have two computers set up to track them. Should one fail, the other one will take over. And the other radio I have is a FT847. So they're my two main radios I've used for the space station. But my radios I've got for the last one I got, which I'm very, very happy with, is a ICOM IC 7300, and very, very happy with it. It's a lovely radio indeed. But I have numerous radios. I've got another 706 Mark II in our little motorhome that we have, and I'm very happy with that as well.
Now, with the IC 7300 and the 706 Mark II, those don't have the VHF and UHF bands in them, do they?
The Mark II does, Mark II-G, and that's all band, all mode. And yes, I have worked the station on that. I haven't never ever done a telebridge link through it, but I have worked the space station on it. Only reason I haven't done a telebridge link through it is because the other radios are wired up and more or less permanently connected to the phone patches involved. But I do run linear amplifiers on 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters to the maximum power that we're allowed to use. And the three of those are actually home built and built from analog TV transmitters. We have got all in Australia's all gone digital now, and I do work for virtually all the three major TV companies in Australia, and I do all their maintenance on the transmitters locally around here for about 150 kilometre radius. And when they threw out their old analog stuff, I held my hand out and they said, well, yes, you can have it. So with a little bit of modifying, it modified very well to high-powered linear amplifiers, which is very handy for the space station and also handy for DX.
What kind of software are you using to track the International Space Station and the satellites?
Oh, I thought you might ask me. I'm using an old DOS program called Instant Track. I know there are a lot of more upmarket ones with much more interesting graphics, but this program I started running it in about 1988. It wasn't compliant for the changeovers of the century, but we did some work on it in 2000. Well, we made a patch for it in about 1999, which worked, but there's a bit of mucking around. But then we upgraded the software so as it could handle the new millennium. And that's what I track it with. So
that means you're still running a DOS PC?
I was up until a couple of years ago, and people said, why are you doing that? I said, can you start tracking a satellite from a cold computer in 30 seconds with Windows? They said, Windows takes a minute or two to load. I said, yeah, that's the point I'm getting at. I said, DOS loads very fast on a Pentium computer, but the actual tracking computers are freestanding, and I'm using what they call a SatTrack 3 and a SatTrack 4, and they were designed by Ron Long. I think it was W6GUS in Ohio. I built one from a kit, and the other one was given to me from a colleague in California, the SatTrack 4, and the SatTrack 3 will take. I can program 12 satellites into it. SatTrack 4 can program 99 satellites into it, plus the sun, which is very handy for aligning your antennas. You can just get it to track the sun and then adjust your antennas to make sure it's tracking by just watching the shadow of the beam as it goes around.
Are you using some kind of commercial controllers for moving the antenna up and down and right and left? Or is this all kind of a homebrew?
That is all homebrewed, and believe it or not, the whole lot is controlled by two windshield wiper motors geared down. The azimuth control is that's geared down through a gearbox, and the final drive onto the main shaft, which is 4 inches in diameter, is the main gear cog on that is out of an old Case International tractor and pinion. It's about 18 inches diameter, machined, and I have built it's spring loaded onto the pinion, and it's got anti-backlash onto it. There's virtually no backlash, and the elevation control is a similar type of thing. And I was using potentiometers to get the feedback of where the antennas were pointing, but some time ago I converted this to magnetic encoders, and these give me far greater accuracy because the International Space Station, about 18 months ago, the Italian Space Agency flew up a 2.4 gig TV transmitter, and we have been receiving stuff on 2.4 gig. Now, this is a big challenge because you have to, I have a 1.2 meter dish on there as well, and to get a signal I have to keep tracking this to within about 2 degrees or less to get an acceptable signal to get digital television down. But that's the new thing, but unfortunately we have a problem with it at the moment, which I think most of the world is aware of, and we are trying to get the existing transmitter down, get it repaired, and getting it brought up again. But this is generally a fairly costly episode because it's taking up space on the supply rocket, and at present we are not bringing anything down. We used to bring it down with the shuttle, but hopefully SpaceX or someone soon will have something that we can bring the equipment down to be repaired and then fly it up again.
What impact has amateur radio had on your family life? I think it's amazing that you had your wife doing Armstrong antenna rotating in your early days of satellites.
She is, yes, she is very keen. I've done, let's see, I've got it written down here. I've done 105 telebridges since I've, and that's with the International Space Station, since it's been up in 2000. I've worked into 16 different countries in that time, and of those 53, I've been directly involved in 53 Australian schools, and 105 schools around the world actually, but all the Australian schools I've been involved with, and the schools that we've done all told around the world since year 2000 is over 1,100. But Normally, if it's an Australian school that's reasonably close handy, I will take the equipment to the school to interface into the phone line, which then goes to the telebridge station that's actually doing the link up and down from the space station. And we have developed a lot of friends through the visits to the schools. A wife comes with me generally, probably 80% of the times, helps me set up, helps me pack up. I've tried to get her to get an amateur license, but she said one in the family is bad enough.
Yeah.
But no, she's been a stalwart and backed me all the way.
Now, you sent me an email when you first agreed to this interview that you have a new ham in your family.
Yes, I have. My grandson, who is 15 years old and lives the other side of Adelaide, he started taking interest probably in about when he was about 10 or 11 in electronics, and I have fostered him along the way and mentored him. And last year, just before about November, I think it would have been, I asked him, I said, "Are you going to try sitting for your license after Christmas during your holidays?" "Oh, yeah," he said, "I might do that, Grandpa." And he, cheeky little fellow, he sat for it about 3 weeks before Christmas and didn't tell me anything about it. He also had a couple of mentors up where he was living, which helped him as well. And he rang me about 2 weeks before Christmas, and this last Christmas, and said, "Grandpa, I've got my foundation license." Foundation license is something that came about I think about 10 or 12 years ago. I'm not quite sure how long. It's a very basic license. Legally, they're only allowed to run 10 watts of power. They are not allowed to build or dismantle any equipment they intend to use on air. And they're allowed on most bands except 20 metres. And they have other restrictions regarding digital stuff as well. But anyway, he's now got his call sign, and he is. We call them the F Troop, the ones with F licenses, and he is now VK5 Foxtrot Zulu Alpha India. I get mixed up when I've got to put an F in front of my own call sign, but hopefully he'll upgrade. We have 3 license categories in Australia. Hopefully he'll upgrade to at least the next one, and then get his advanced license in due course. But he is very interested. I helped him put up antennas at Christmas time, and the second day after, he, with a little bit of help from me, he worked Oscar 91 from into Perth, which is probably about 2,000 kilometres distance, and he is now building a small antenna tracking system to handle antennas to probably 6, 7, 2 metres long or so. He's going to be the new generation. He's very keen on, like all kids, computers and everything else, and this tracking system is based around Arduino setup and small motors geared down. And but I was just talking to his father earlier on the phone today, and I said, "What's young Marley up to?" And he said, I can't get him away from this antenna rotator he's building." But he's keen, and I think that's a new generation, and I've encouraged him. I said miniaturization and computerization, programming. I said all the things to get into, and I said you can extend that into your amateur radio fields as well, and that's what he's doing.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think there's been a new surge of interest. There certainly has been in Australia since the foundation license has come in, and I don't know how many other countries have brought it in, but it's a great thing to get the younger ones in to sit for the license I had to, or the advanced license. It does require quite a bit of experience and reading, but to kick them off, I mean, we're up against a lot of competition here. Computers, the internet, voice over IP, all these things. It's, I mean, once upon a time when I started, and probably yourself, it was something pretty special to have a two-way radio in your car and be able to talk to your mates. And of course, be able to talk to someone on the other side of the world was unheard of in any other way by radio. But nowadays, you know, the world news, you get the news at night time, and it's got every highlight that's happened everywhere in the world. And amateur radio is up against up against all this with international communications. But I think if you can incorporate computers into the field, digital electronics, there's still a lot to experiment with out there. And of course, the microwave frequencies are another thing. I haven't 2.4 gigas as high as I go, but we have several around here that are working much higher in frequency. And I think this is the way to experiment. But as I say, I'm coming up 80 next year, and I've got enough gear here to keep me occupied for a while, Eric.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Well, the biggest thing I found was shifting from old analog tuning systems and everything else into digital tuning systems, digital modes of communications that have come about. And I mean, once upon a time, I used to say, although I'm not a Morse man or CW man myself, I fully accept that the old timers used to say, "Oh, it's the most reliable form of communications you can get. You can't hear anything on voice, but you can always get through on CW." Well, some of the new digital modes now are giving CW a real challenge, I think, and I think this is the future in communications. What project do you have on your bench right now? What are you building? I have just built up a 10 meg GPS locked reference to run into the back of my Marconi signal generator. This will, I mean, it's the Marconi is fairly accurate, but once you get up into the microwave frequencies, it's a little bit of discrepancy, but I can now lock it into the atomic standard that the GPS satellites have on them, and it will lock onto and feed a absolute accurate 10 meg signal into the signal generator, which multiplies up to whatever gig you were working on. That was the last major project. I've only just finished that, and it goes 24 hours a day. What homebrew project are you the most proud of? Probably the linear amplifiers I've built. They required quite a bit of modifying, and from TV stuff. That's probably the proudest I've been of building any piece of equipment. I built that was built from a kit, actually, the tracking computer for the satellites. Probably the thing it requires that gets the most attention is the satellite tracking antennas. When I say I've built those up myself, and the interface between that and the computers, and I mean, you can buy it, but I've seen the pictures of your tracking system. It's fantastic. The gearboxes and all that stuff. I still get quite a lot of information. People must see it on the web and want to know how I've built it. But it's something that I've never ever drawn scale plans on how it's done. I'm fortunate that I've got my own lathe and workshop, and mechanically I did do engineering many years ago, and I've got a reasonable knowledge of that as well.
Tony, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been a real pleasure, and I always love talking to people in Australia. It's one of my bucket list destinations.
Thanks, Eric. Just one thing I'd like to state with ARIS, Amateur Radio on International Space Station. This is an educational program for any students anywhere in the world, and anyone that listens to this and has grandchildren at school, you can get an application form to fill out and get the school involved. And at the present, we've got a waiting list of about, I don't know how many schools, but around about 12 months around the world. But 12 months doesn't take long to go, and you could have your son or daughter, granddaughter, grandson speak to an astronaut as they pass over and circle around the world. And if you're interested, have a look at the ARIS website.
Tony, I'll put a link to it on the show notes page so that people can just click on that. That sounds great. Tony, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. And with that, I'll wish you 73.
Thanks, Eric, and I also wish you 73s, and thanks very much for interviewing me.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in
VK5ZAI
in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alexa, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.